Max Gawn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Nat Fyfe from the Fremantle Footy Club.
Trent Cotchin from the Richmond Footy Club.
Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Patrick Cooch from the Carlton Footy Club.
It's Rory Sloane here from the Adelaide Crows.
This is Tom Mitchell. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Hey friends, you got MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you're well and welcome back to another episode of the 50 most relevant, counting down who I think are the most relevant players across your SuperCoach, DreamTeam and AFL fantasy sides for the 2023 season. A big name today, and he hasn't been this low in the 50 probably ever. Max Gawn is on the conversation as we get to the number 28 spot. We love having this man on the Coaches Panel, and he's a regular feature. Kane is back for yet another big episode. Hello, mate.
Hello, mate. Yes, very big. Very tall man.
Yes.
Very high scoring man.
Yes.
Very big, complicated new situation at Melbourne in the ruck department.
I like giving you the tricky ones. And I don't feel like I've given you any easy ones at any point where you go, no, you pass, or no, you start. Every single player you've had this preseason is complex. And for that very reason, you've talked about Max Gawn. Historically, top ruck, jog on next. But now something substantial has changed, which we'll get to in a minute. 31 years of age. His top score last year was a 152 against Collingwood. That's in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam, while he just narrowly missed hitting another double ton in SuperCoach. It was a 198 against the Swans. 154 is his career high score in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam, so almost hit that marker last year. That was back in 2019 against the Kangaroos. And in that same game, a career high, 212 for SuperCoach. His price point is linked to the average, and that's a 103.2 in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam. In those formats, he's going to set you back just over $910,000 in AFL Fantasy and just a touch under $940,000 in DreamTeam. While SuperCoach, his average of 113 means he's priced at $622,100. Kane, it's normally at this point in the podcast, we wax lyrical about a player's seasonal average. We talk about how many hundreds they've got over a previous season, how many 120s, how many sub 80s they might have had, where they ranked inside the top portion of the AFL to highlight their scoring power and pedigree and ability. And then we get to the part of the podcast where it's like that. Okay, well, that's the past. Let's forecast forward. And we could do that with Max Gawn. But I feel like we'd be wasting about 5 minutes of oxygen for people, because if you've played fantasy footy, regardless of the format, for more than a year, you know this. Max is the best scoring ruck in the game and has been for a long period of time. However, one big thing has changed. He now has arguably the other best scoring ruck in the game now joining him in the side. And so to talk about what he's done in the past, it's kind of pointless because so much has changed in the off-season for the Ds.
Yeah, it's been massive, MJ. I think it was something that no one quite believed when it was rumoured, towards the back end of last year, that this could actually be a destination for Grundy, Melbourne. But from a Melbourne point of view, it sounded like once they heard he was available, they were straight on the case and they were really keen to acquire him. So I'm curious on how it breaks down. There's only can be one ruck going up in a ruck contest these days. So it's fascinating because Gawn, especially last year and the year prior, did have a really solid second ruck in the team. Luke Jackson was a young ruckman, super athletic guy. And that split tended to be about, anywhere from 50-50 all the way up to sort of 75-25 in Gawn's favour, depending on the matchup. And that was a big thing with Melbourne that does make it tricky with Gawn, is there were certain matchups where they said, this is a matchup for Jackson. This is a matchup for Gawn. So, for example, I remember in round 2 against the Suns, Jared Witt's second game off an ACL, they used Jackson more in that role because he's so athletic. He's so quick around the ground for a ruckman. His follow-up work is so impressive. So that's the thing we're going to have to be careful with Gawn is there matchups that they say this is more of a Gawn matchup? Yeah. This is more of a Grundy matchup. And that's something we don't really want in our sides at the most part, is we want to sort of see how it plays out when we know that these ruckmen who are the big scorers have the lion's share, 65% plus. And they clearly both can't have 65% as the primary ruck. So, on one hand, Max Gawn's the captain. He's a premiership captain.
Yep.
He's more familiar with the Melbourne system. And that's the thing with these big moves is, obviously they'd want to incorporate Grundy in the team. They think there's a role for him. They think there's a way they can use both of them. But I think a positive for Gawn is if it wasn't working with that ruck tandem and they had to go a smaller forward line or a more traditional forward, it probably would be Grundy that's squeezed out.
Yeah.
Now, again, $600,000 or whatever that salary is a lot of money for a guy. But also, if it's not working, it's a team sport at the end of the day. And then Gawn, in my mind, is that better pure ruckman. Melbourne doesn't really have someone racking up those numbers that was sort of peak Grundy, where he's that extra midfielder. They're pretty set with Oliver, Petrarca, Viney, Brayshaw. That's a pretty stable core. They don't really ask Gawn to run around and rack up the footy like that. So I think in that pure hit-out style, that's, Gawn's advantage. But it's fascinating, MJ, because Gawn clearly, when he is the solo ruck, he's through the roof. He only had one game last year where he didn't have Jackson in the team, and he went 149 in DT and 172 in SuperCoach.
Beast.
So that's the thing. There's value there if he's the sole ruck, but clearly, as we start, towards the end of Jan, we think that Grundy's in the team. We know Gawn's dealing with a hamstring. That time of recording, we don't quite know how that shakes out.
Sure.
But I think that's the only case you could really make for Gawn is that he's the one experienced in the system. He's the captain of the club. There's no structure that I see that says this isn't a week where Gawn plays.
Yes, I agree.
So I think that's the thing at the moment. If you think Gawn has some upside, which he clearly does if he's just unleashed as a 75, 80% ruckman. But at the same time, that Grundy's going to at least get a fair crack at cementing his spot, trialing whatever they've worked on in the preseason to integrate both of these two guys. And while Gawn can play high time on ground, which is a real positive.
Yes.
We know being behind the ball or being key forward, they're volatile roles in terms of if you're just doing your ruck and then tacking on at full back or tacking on at full forward, you can have bursts where you clunk a mark, kick a goal, and the points fly in. But other times you can just be left out of the play for what feels like a whole quarter. So, you clearly want your ruckman on the ball, and it's just not going to be able to happen. So I think for me, simply he's a watch. We watch him how he goes. But obviously, as I said, things could break in terms of pick up a forward status after, playing a 50-50 forward ruck role. And again, it only takes an injury or Melbourne to play, not to their standard and lose some games and have to shake things up. Or someone in the VFL to really step up. Van Ruin hasn't debuted yet. They just spent an early pick on Jefferson, who's another forward.
Yeah.
McDonald never really got healthy last year. So
no. And Brown was questionable during the year as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's definitely guys that, when you're structuring up your team, that's who I think Grundy's really competing with is, yes, he's providing some ruck support, but he's going to have to be really delivering up forward for mine. He's going to have to be providing, an avenue to goal because, if there's some young guys, like I mentioned, Van Ruin or Jefferson, there's some experienced guys like Brown and McDonald that can be, 45, 50 plus goal kickers in a season. The way Melbourne blends that forward line is it seems to be the three smalls who rarely miss in Spargo, Neil Bullen and Pickett. Yep. You've got Fritsch down there as the fourth sort of hybrid. And then you roll through that midfielder. Usually it's a Petrarca, but Oliver's actually, with his height and strength, a pretty reliable option too. So you throw in a couple key forwards and a ruckman and all those type of things. That mix between the ruck line and the forward line, how they work together, really fascinates me. And I think that's going to be the key for Gawn. If Grundy's just not able to clunk those marks, bring the ball to ground, apply some pressure, I think his spot could be in question, even though it is a big acquisition. And they obviously at the moment, I feel like they have the intention of getting him in at all costs, giving him a go, supporting Gawn, who, as you mentioned off the top, is a bit older now. He's in his early 30s. So there's clearly some management there. But starting price, it seems hard because it is quite a fair price. Like it wasn't a massive Gawn season, but it was still really, really good. So for me, I think the reason he's got to be on this list is it only takes an injury to Grundy, some poor form from Melbourne, and maybe even some key forwards to be just firing at VFL level and sort of earn their spot. And then Gawn's a solo ruck again. Getting 80% ruck with a Tom McDonald, a Ben Brown, these types of guys just chipping in.
Yeah.
So that's what I think is really fascinating is that ceiling is still there.
It really is. And it's the reminder for you as you're listening to this podcast. Maybe you've seen the name, even read the article at coachespanel.tv going, boys, he's not a top 2 ruck. He's not a value ruck. Why is Gawn in the 50 most relevant? Well, it's another reminder for us that this is not the top scoring 50 players or the top 50 value players. It is the 50 players that I think are going to be the most relevant. And what happens with Gawn is hugely relevant because it has cascading impacts, not just for him directly, but for Grundy, for how that midfield mix in general works. You mentioned about how good Grundy is early days in his career, maybe not so much the past year or two as he battled some injury and some form at Collingwood, but he was the extra midfielder in that side. Gawn was that too. Now they really can do some fun structural stuff to make a significant difference. As I think about Gawn forward, what you're looking for is if he does play more time forward, one, there's a DPP gain. And that could be really significant, especially in SuperCoach, where hit-outs to advantage, contested marks, the weighting of your impact of what you do at certain times of the game can increase the scoring benefit for you too. I think if you're a Gawn owner, or want to be a Gawn owner, up forward he hasn't been great, but you're looking for moments over his career to go, can he put it together where he shares the ruck with someone and does a great job forward? And the most prominent game that comes to my mind for that is the preliminary final of 2021, Kane, against Geelong. In that game, his centre bounce attendances were his second lowest in the season. It was 59%. It was only round 7 against North Melbourne. And in that game, we saw Luke Jackson have an almost season high. 41%. The only one was higher in that year of 2021. 42, round 7 against North Melbourne. So intrinsically linked. But what happened in that preliminary final? Here's his stat line. 19 possessions, 5 marks, 33 hitouts, 6 tackles, 5 goals. Unicorn game, no doubt about that. But if you're looking for a moment to go, can Gawn play a valuable role outside of the ruck? A game like that gives you a little bit of confidence that he can do it. And then I'm curious on this question, Kane, that I want to throw to you. About a decade ago, there was another dominant ruck duo. And if you haven't played fantasy footy for that long, you don't know who I'm talking about. But West Coast had themselves a similar dilemma. They didn't trade into it in the same way Melbourne had, but they had probably the best ruckman in the AFL at the time, Dean Cox, and then they drafted what was to be one of the best AFL ruckmen for a good chunk of his career, Nick Naitanui. So we have seen them coexist. Both have great seasons, and fantasy-wise, not really eat each other too much.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating, MJ, because in 2011, Dean Cox actually had his career high year with Nick Nat, which is pretty fascinating because we know that Dean Cox was
a beast,
the best fantasy ruckman. So in 2011, Cox went at 107.5 across 22 games in DT and 122 in SuperCoach. Nick Nat in 2011 played 20 games, 75 DT, 93 SuperCoach. And then jumping forward the next year, Cox 99.6 across 22 games in DT, 112 in SuperCoach. And Nick Nat was 86 DT, 113 in SuperCoach. So clearly, as you can pick up there, SuperCoach, we obviously know with the way that scoring system works, being hyper efficient, really giving that midfield first use, which both of those guys were amazing at. Those are elite numbers. And those are right on that, elite top handful of ruckman in SuperCoach.
Yeah.
Looking at Nick Nat, 86 in 2012, 2015 is his highest averaging year, which was an 88. So if you think about that Dean Cox had his career high alongside him, it shows it is possible. I think clearly what you're looking for there is points per minute. And that's
Yes.
why if you're in that matchup, if you're a Nick Nat and you're as good as a number one ruck, you're going to get some time matched up against that second ruck or that, that third tall that has to come in and do a role. So, a lot of these rucks, they're hovering around that 55, the best are sort of at 60% hit out win rate.
Yeah.
And that's important because if there's only 100 ruck contests a game for Max and Grundy to share, and let's just say they take 50-50.
Sure. Line share.
That's basically 50 hit outs for Melbourne to grab. So if they take 50 of them, they win their hit outs at just say 50% because it's easy maths for us, MJ. That's only 25 hit outs a game. Now we know when Grundy was putting up his massive seasons.
Well over 30.
He was 38 and a half and 41. Now those are his incredible
Careers.
alpha season where he's 120 plus and was one of the best players in the comp. And Gawn, his has come back to earth a bit as Jackson's come into that side, but he had seasons in 2018 where he was going 45 and a half, 39 and a half. So again, last year though, Gawn was at 26 because that's tended to be how they went together. Grundy was at 30. So that can sort of sustain. But as we know, the hard thing is if you're not getting those ruck contests as much, if you're only splitting 50-50, harder to get that hack kick, that rushed handball, that tackle. And I think that's what's so fascinating, MJ, is how each of them perform in the forward line will have a massive impact. If Gawn is clunking everything in the forward line and he's converting his shots at goal, well, then he might only have to spend 25 to 30% in the ruck. And that's huge for Grundy.
Yes.
Because Grundy, and he's used to being a 75, 80% guy. Like that's just what all his best years have been. He's been that key ruck. So if Gawn's on fire down there, happy days. It might be Grundy that gets that bump.
Yeah.
But obviously, like I said earlier, conversely, if Gawn's not really going well and Grundy's not really going well, again, it might open the door for that other forward to come in. And again, I just don't see Gawn being out of the side.
No. And
the other issue is as well is down back, Melbourne's set for talls. That trio of Petty, Lever and May.
They got it.
That's all you really need. So if you start putting a Gawn behind there, even as a loose, and that was something that we saw Richmond do a lot where they wouldn't actually put a Nane Curvis in the ruck in the forward line, their forward line. They would say, you sit at about 60 metres out, we'll put a Rewald or someone else in there, or even a Sean Grigg. And if you want to kick it out of there, that's where Toby is. But clearly,
correct.
Maybe that's where a Grundy and a Gawn, one does take the forward stoppage, the other sits on the 60. But it's tough. And I think that's the real big unknown, MJ, is that it could break a certain way for Gawn more than Grundy.
Yes.
That he's just back to his best.
Yes.
He's just back to his best. And I think for me, that's why I would have Gawn ahead of Grundy. Now, I know he's dealing with a hamstring at the moment, but I just see if it broke right for Gawn, and then we're talking clearly if one of them goes down with a long injury.
Oh, the other
that's a huge spike.
skyrockets.
But I think if we're not talking injury and we're just talking how Melbourne could structure up to win games.
Coexist.
Because that's the thing you've always got to think about is what could happen here? Who could move? We've spoken about that earlier with Brayshaw.
Yeah.
People say Lockie Hunter comes in, but is Lockie Hunter better than a James Jordan?
Yes,
what if you lose?
right.
What if you lose? A half-back. Well, Brayshaw's probably a better half-back than a James Harms who could replace Brayshaw in the mids. That's what's so fascinating with these teams.
The cascading variable.
It cascades really quickly. But a captain of a club who's a premiership captain who is superior in my eyes as the tap ruckman and that centre bounce ruckman.
Correct.
He's not going to lose that chance. Again, if you're a Grundy owner, you're saying, Max, I hope you go forward and kick 60 goals this year. And basically be a pseudo full forward that splits time in the ruck because you're wanting 70% with Grundy to really cash in.
I think so.
So it's fascinating, MJ. And that's where I think for draft, it gets really interesting because we know with draft, you're going for gold. All you're going for
that year doesn't matter
upside.
everything else. Yeah. Well, I think
that's where the value is going to be tricky.
Yeah. Well, I would presume most will draft Max no earlier than the third ruck off the board. Now, some will say, I see the upside of Grundy. And so Grundy might be third. Others might go Sean Darcy. I'm not as worried about the Jackson split there. I think he's a bit more aerobically going to be able to not have to eat the centre bounces. So a lot of people's draft boards with their ruck ranks all will have English at one. I'd be really surprised if someone says, I don't think Tim English is the number one ruck. Some will question Marshall at 2. For me, I just don't see anyone else playing a lead ruck role. He'll always share with someone. Every ruckman shares. It's question of percentage and how much. And so I think Marshall will be likely on draft boards, people's ranked number 2, unless they're drafting off previous year's ranks and averages. That's a different story. Gawn could go anywhere at 3rd, 4th, or 5th. He could. I don't see him regressing under 100 in SuperCoach. I can't see him going under 90 in Dream Team and Fantasy. I'll make a statement and then I'll curious on your ranking. Just because he dips his scoring doesn't mean he drifts his spot in where he finishes ranked against the other rucks. So even if he drops in SuperCoach down to 100, he could still be a top 2 or 3 ruck. Even if he drops down to a 95 ruck, still could be that. Picks up a DPP, a variable injury changes. So much can happen. That's why we talk about relevance through this series. You introduced me to this concept maybe a year or 2 ago, basically where it's you tier out everybody in their division. So all the forwards, you group them in tier 1, 2, 3, and you draft via tiers rather than numerical ranking. But there's not just a tier ranking that's horizontal, so to speak. There's a vertical component too, where who you've got at R2 might be your M20. So if people draft in a similar style of that, where they draft vertically and horizontally in how they run the columns and the rows, could mean they might see some value in Gawn. That's a big preamble to ask one big question. He'll be someone's R1. What round of the draft are you looking at Max Gawn?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, MJ. And it would be a fascinating draft. Imagine if you only said, hey, guys, we're doing round by round, but we're only allowed to pick defenders. And then we're going to do all the defender pool, and then we did the mids. And that's why, clearly, the way everyone drafts, it doesn't work like that. And that's why, the vertical board is you've got all your backs in one column, you've got all your mids in one column, rucks and forwards. They're just down the page. But as you said, I'm not just comparing Gawn to English and Marshall. If I'm spending a pick on him,
it's got to be.
What else am I not? What am I not choosing in the other columns?
That's right.
And that's why, for me, with where he's at, now you've got to factor in some of that upside that we just spoke about. If it breaks this way, he's right back up to the real pointy end of the board. But clearly, there is a guy there that's really, really good in his team and has been brought over for a reason. So for me, ruckman in draft tend to go with that sort of same value as mids.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, unless you're playing 16 people in a team, if you're just playing 10 people, there's rucks that are in that bench spot, that reserve spot. Handcuffing becomes a lot more important. You can sort of manage it. So let's just assume it's a 10-team league.
Sure.
I think Gawn for mine is going to be a low 90. So I'm looking at low 90 mids as his competition.
Yeah.
Which may sound crazy to people. When you think about, there's over 20 mids that went over 100.
Yeah.
And typically, for every one mid drafted, there's one of the other positions. So, for example, if you've got one mid, there might be one of defender, forward, ruck. So by the time 20 mids are gone, there's typically 20 of those other positions gone as well. My point being, MJ, for me, there's probably 30, 35 mids that are around that average for me.
Yeah.
Which means that Gawn's probably in the 7th, 8th, 9th round.
Yeah.
Just purely on what I'm giving up because, if I'm choosing a 95 mid, 90 mid, we know by the time you get to those back end of the mids, you're having to grab 75 guys.
Yeah.
There might be a ruckman there that,
is an 80.
Average 78.
You get a
Reece
Stanley
80
type.
Yeah, you might get a Reece Stanley Segler double.
Yeah.
And that's the point for me is that, as you mentioned, he could be the third ruck. He could be the best. But I think third's about the highest he'd go. I agree. I think Marshall and English in some order ahead of him. But as you can see there, if he's 7th, 8th, 9th round with those other mids that I just want to
You
lock
just
away
can't
and
say
build
no
that
at
depth.
that point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's probably 8th round that you're starting to go, okay, this is, that'd be a pick in the 70s in a 10-team league. Okay, let's take this guy that if it breaks right, I could pick up a forward status. I could pick up more responsibility with
one.
team change. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't be going before the 7th.
Yeah.
I think if you're taking him at the start of the 7th, that's pick 61. That's still pretty high. That's pretty high currency. So
100%.
anytime after that, now his name's Max Gawn, MJ. It's going to be pretty tough for a lot of casual fans to.
Well, that'll be
pass on
the
guy.
thing. If they see the name, I think in SuperCoach formats, they'll draft him even a round or two sooner.
I was going to say, for a
because of that.
SuperCoach, you'd have to move up just purely on how proficient
Because
he
of
is,
that.
and the pie is still the same.
Correct.
You're still going to get
scoring is still the
rewarded,
same.
and you can take advantage of those. If he
That's
is
right.
matched up with that second ruck, there might be even more hitouts to advantage.
That's
Because
right.
as I said, the 50 ruck hitouts a game, just with the finite number of ruck contests. But again, as we know, it's a big difference going up against that primary ruck.
As
and then
opposed to
that
number two.
That number two. So again, MJ's probably, if you're really bullish, he's probably a late 4th, early 5th in an SC format.
Yeah, I'm all right with that there.
But again, you could come to the end of the season and say they tried Grundy for 6 weeks. Ben Ruin was just red hot. McDonald was fit. Brown was fit. They didn't really need Grundy, and Gawn's just back firing. So I think that's where it comes to that point where you go, I'm comparing him to these 90 mids, but this 90 mid only has a best case of 95, whereas Max Gawn could grab 4 status after 6 weeks and then go back to 110.
Yeah.
And that's what you've always got to caveat in, especially in draft where it's first or nothing. Like,
yes,
we're not just trying to get a good rank.
No.
Like, if you want upside and, again, breaks a certain way, that's a league-winning pick.
Yeah, I think it's a good shout. Hey, mate, love your thoughts and processing as we all try to get our head around what's happening through the Melbourne midfield. We know Max Gawn will be relevant, either because of what he does or how he impacts others. Remember, it's the 50 most relevant, not the 50 top scorers. Some great work from you on this episode, Kane. Thank you, mate.
No worries, mate.
If you want to go and read the article, it is online for you now. We've got some of the splits that Kane alluded to about the Cox and Nick Naitanui numbers there, just to help you to process that, as well as all the other players we've revealed so far in the 50 most relevant. You can go and check that out at coachespanel.tv. The links for our Patreon supporter group, you can go and get that. There is a bunch of hidden bits of content, podcasts, and rewards for you to go and check out, including our Keeper League rankings, where we have given you our top 50 players, put them into a number of different tiers. You can go and see that full season that is available for our Patreons only and Spotify podcast subscribers. Oh, by the way, if you do become a Spotify podcast subscriber, don't say that 10 times fast. Not only do you get those tier rankings, you'll also get our in-season round reviews, which are normally only reserved for our premium tier Patreon. So plenty of bonus stuff come for you if you jump in and support the Coaches Panel. Number 27 today is going to be a big one when we get to him. And we've got a special guest on the podcast. He's had some nice high rankings over the past few seasons. Holmesy, you've heard him on the pod. Maybe you've seen him on Twitter. He's talking about number 27 tomorrow. Who are we talking about? We're going west. But how far west? And is it Western Australia? Or is it the Western Bulldogs? We're talking about a midfielder from the west of something. You'll find out tomorrow on the 50 Most Relevant.